most of the time, I try to keep my own personal politics out of the videos I make. Cause most of the time, it's irrelevant. Now, if you guys did watch my abortion video or the Bangladesh bus video, you'll know that I'm extremely skeptical of any government involvement, and that it should be the measure of absolute last resort. Now, with regards to the California high-speed rail, you can make the case that it is a case of too little government involvement or too much government involvement, depending on which side you want to die on. From the Wendover's production, California high-speed rail in the top C. So if you guys enjoyed the video, please go check him out. So let's see what does Wendover Productions have to say about the failure of the California high-speed rail.
In 1993, California's legislature voted to form the California Intercity High-Speed Rail Commission, formally starting the process to build a high-speed railway to connect the state's major cities. Today, 3 decades on and 6 years past the first planned completion date, the project is 7 times over budget, now devoid of a planned completion date, and lacking a single foot of laid track. But back in 2008, after a decade and a half of study, California presented a detailed plan for the railroad to its voters. On the very same ballot where Californians made their choice between Obama and McCain, they also marked their opinion on whether the state should build America's first true high-speed rail system. LA to San Francisco, 2 hours and 40 minutes, $33 to $42 billion, initial operations by 2020. The voters' answer, of course, was yes. With 52.6% support, Prop 1A passed. But then they actually had to go and build the thing, and this proved challenging. The difficulty of building high-speed rail is that it needs a continuous block of geographically and geometrically compatible land. Other railroads typically run on tracks that follow routes that have had trains for dozens, even over 100 years, but the geometry of these tracks is too tight. High-speed trains need long, gentle curves to maintain their high speeds. So much of the work leading up to Prop 1A was determining where, in broad strokes, it'd make the most sense to build these tracks. Through years of debate, environmental analysis, legal proceedings, and study, they'd weighed the trade-offs and made selections of which mountain passes, regions, and cities the railroad should hit. But as construction started, the planners started to pay for their decisions. One of their most difficult was how to leave Los Angeles. You see, the sprawling urban area is surrounded on all sides by massive mountains. After all, it's the city where one can drive from warm weather surfing to high-altitude skiing in just an hour or two, traffic permitting. The stakes of getting the selection right were high, as building high-speed rail lines through these seismically active mountains would inevitably be one of the costliest and most complicated sections of engineering. Not just
I think Los Angeles needs to fix its car dependency culture before it can build a high-speed rail. I mean, look at the urban sprawl. I mean, give me a minute.
This project, but
look at the urban sprawl. What's the point of building a high-speed rail through all these and then having to drive to your final destination?
Any high-speed rail project ever attempted worldwide. After preliminary study, there were really 2 serious contenders: Tejon Pass and the Palmdale alignment. At first glance, Tejon Pass was the most obvious. It's where Interstate 5 crosses the mountains, meaning there's already road infrastructure to allow for construction access, there was already power infrastructure to provide the backbone of what's needed for electric trains, and there was already environmental impact, easing the environmental review process. Tejon was also just, quite simply, the more direct route. The system had to meet its wildly ambitious voter-approved 2 hour and 40-minute trip time. It was
Now, San Francisco to California is about 560 kilometers. So, if you want to meet the 2 hour 40-minute mark, you have to travel about 130 miles per hour. I don't know why I use metric at the first end and then switch to imperial in the second part. But the conversion is on screen. And that's assuming it's traveling in a straight line between those 2 cities. Now in reality, they have to go much further because they have to, curve around the mountains, go through tunnels, or they have to curve around certain things. So they are not exactly traveling in one straight line. So in reality, they have to go much faster than that. Now it's perfectly feasible, but their infrastructure will look something like this on screen. Sure, the interstate highway have shown that they can build something like this on a similar scale. However, it has been almost 50 years since they built the highway. And American cities' designs have evolved due to the fact that they were incentivized to run highways through their cities, making everyone in that city car dependent. So they might need to fix that before they put any high-speed rail through anything. Alright?
Literally written into California law following Prop 1A, meaning missing that target is a violation of California law. Taking anything but the Tahan Pass route would force planners to find those minutes elsewhere. That made it surprising when the California High-Speed Rail Authority voted for the alternative, the Palmdale alignment. This was, and still is, a massively controversial choice. Depending on who you ask, this detour will add between 3 and 12 minutes to the trip time, a massive penalty that will drive up spending elsewhere to compensate. On first glance, this decision makes little sense, but some theories have been put forward. Chief among them, simple political cronyism. In the early days of planning, there was an LA County Board of Supervisors member named Michael Antonovich who represented the district that included Palmdale. He believed a routing through Palmdale would buoy the region, both through job opportunities during construction and economic development once the train made it a viable commuter town to LA.
Yeah, we want our representatives to represent us in Congress/Parliament, whatever your country calls it. When our representatives do a very good job representing their constituents, that's kind of what happens. They can derail the entire project due to their advocacy. Now, some of us don't want representatives who compromise. Some of us just want the project to be done, which is one of the reasons why politics can be a very messy affair most of the time.
Meanwhile, the Rail Authority's board included a member named Jerry Epstein, who otherwise was a real estate developer with major holdings in Marina del Rey, which operated under a long-term lease from the county. He was looking for votes from the Board of Supervisors to renew this lease, so he allegedly struck a tit-for-tat deal. Support from Antonovich for his lease renewal in exchange for his support for Antonovich's Palmdale alignment ambitions. While the board encompassed 9 members, Epstein's influence was reportedly enough to persuade the rest to follow their lead. Detractors of the project use this as example number 1 of how corruption has brought California HSR to its current state.
Now in the US, they don't call it corruption, they call it lobbying. What's the difference? Well, one of them is in the Constitution, so...
But while this story almost certainly has some truth to it, its frequent characterization as the deciding factor for the Palmdale alignment is a massive oversimplification of the decision. You see, the Palmdale alignment has some legitimate advantages. To start, the economic development opportunities that made it so attractive for Antonovich were real and could be a positive for the entire housing-crunched region. Unlike almost everywhere in the LA basin, where additional housing stock primarily comes through densifying, the Antelope Valley has room to sprawl, the primary way housing realistically gets built in the US. It could become an attractive low-cost commuter town, which would provide downward pressure on housing prices for the entire region. Picking Palmdale also represented some real foresight. Just as California's HSR project was in its planning phases, so too was what is now known as Brightline West, a privately operated high-speed line now in construction from Vegas to LA. It started construction long after California HSR and is expected to finish far sooner thanks in part to its decision to not attempt the hard part, construction through urban areas. They'd cover most of the journey, but stop short of going to any major population center in LA, rather terminating on its outskirts at Rancho Cucamonga Station, about 40 miles or 65 kilometers from downtown LA. The thinking was that this would be good enough to be competitive with flying, since travelers could drive or take local trains to get to this station. But if California HSR were to build through Palmdale, the two lines could be connected by building a relatively simple and low-cost 50-mile, 80-kilometer line across the flat, open desert. This would improve both projects. California HSR trains from the Bay Area could now run to Las Vegas, and a likely sub-4-hour runtime would still be reasonably competitive versus air travel. Brightline West, meanwhile, would now have a route deeper into LA. They could use California HSR's tracks as a means to service LA Union Station, likely making it a more competitive service as well. While this interconnection is not formally in motion as a project, it's also far from a pipe dream. In fact, California HSR and Brightline West made sure that they'd use compatible signaling systems, track geometry, and standards to keep the door open for this ambitious future. At the end of the day, though, according to the Rail Authority at least, cost was the biggest factor. Once they looked in detail at what it would actually take to build each of these options, they determined that Tahan Pass required quite a lot of tunneling and earthworks, leading to a price tag that was not meaningfully cheaper than the Palmdale alternative despite the far shorter distance. Again, at least according to their analysis. So, even with a slightly longer trip time via Palmdale, the authority decided that the development, connection, and cost-saving opportunities made Palmdale, on balance, a better route. But plenty disagree. Plenty call their decision-making process deeply flawed. You see, the alignment study through Tejon Pass did not include it taking the most efficient path through this, Tejon Ranch. Despite its name, this massive tract of private land, one of the largest in the state, is hardly a ranch anymore. Rather, it's a massive commercial enterprise traded on the New York Stock Exchange with a market cap of $500 million, generating tens of millions of dollars of annual revenues by exploiting its land for real estate development and agriculture. The company strongly opposed a Tejon Pass alignment as this area is theoretically its highest value land thanks to the connectivity Interstate 5 provides. The company has long had plans for a massive housing development in the area, and a high-speed rail line running through it would only negatively affect the theoretical value of this project. After all, there'd never realistically be a stop to serve such a small population center, and the noise pollution and visual impact would likely turn buyers away. Compounding the difficulty, in order to get approval for this development, Tejon Ranch struck a deal with a coalition of environmental groups to put hundreds of thousands of acres of its land into conservation status. So, while California HSR does have eminent domain authority, meaning it could just take private land regardless of owners' wishes, doing so would inevitably set off a lengthy legal battle both with this well-funded and politically connected private company and a coalition of powerful environmental nonprofits. The state didn't want to deal with that, so in its alignment studies, it always assumed that a Tejon Pass alignment would include a long stretch of tunnels to route around the proposed development, even if it did still pass through the ranch's land. Independent analysis has suggested that this inflated costs by as much as $6 billion, pushing the estimated price up to roughly on par with Palmdale. Critics suggest that the state should have seriously considered an alignment that did take the most efficient route through Tejon Ranch's land, and in doing so, there's every chance they'd have selected that option given the likely lower costs and faster trip times. To this day, there remains a vigorous debate over this decision, and many suggest that how nonsensical it looks is, in fact, the most damning evidence that the real reason behind Palmdale's selection was, in fact, the alleged political cronyism. But after exiting the LA Basin, next the project is to cross the flat agricultural lands of the Central Valley. This is by far the simplest section of the line, but that doesn't mean it's simple. There were really two primary alignment options. One was, once again, the I-5 corridor. Just as with Tejon Pass, the fact that there was an existing right-of-way was attractive. The railroad could primarily route in the median or alongside the highway, few bridges would have to be built, and little private land would have to be acquired. In fact, this is the exact strategy that Brightline West is using for its Vegas service. It's building in the I-15 median, enabling its theoretical lightning-fast construction timeline and lower cost. I-5 is also the most direct alignment for California HSR geographically, allowing for 11 to 20-minute faster trip times, once again depending who you ask, and was estimated as 5.6% lower in cost by the High-Speed Rail Authority's feasibility studies. The alignment was so attractive, in fact, that France's national rail operator, SNCF, was briefly looking at partnering with the state to build its system under the condition that they chose this alignment. But just as with Tejon versus Palmdale, the more costly option had its advantages. Particularly, essentially every major population center in the Central Valley is on its east side. The corridor along I-5 is mostly bounded by small agricultural communities and their fields, meaning those in cities along the east side of the Central Valley would need to drive to pick up the train, making their travel times longer and the train less competitive versus planes. This would then push down ridership, pushing down revenue, and making the theoretical economics of the railway more challenging. But
Serious question. What's the ideal distance between stations when you're building a high-speed rail? Because if you're gonna spend a lot of time coming to a stop and then getting back up to speed again, which means that the train will have to be much faster than the 130 miles per hour previously discussed target speed if they want to meet the San Francisco to LA in 2 hour 40-minute time target. Which means that they'll need far more expensive infrastructure so that the trains can actually travel at those kinds of speed if they were to come to a stop and then get back up to speed again, right? I mean, they have to average out 130 miles per hour, best case scenario, right?
More importantly, in the eyes of the early planners, it would make the politics more challenging. You see, the constituencies in San Francisco and LA were the easiest to win over. They had a lot to gain from the service, and their left-leaning politics were generally more compatible with big public spending for public transport. Central Valley residents, meanwhile, were the swing votes. The rural areas were always going to vote majority no. The project might be able to sway some with the promise of jobs during construction, but the easiest votes to pick up were those in the urban areas to the east, like Bakersfield, Fresno, and Merced. So to gain their support, the project had to provide service to them, pushing it towards a longer, costlier, and more complex eastern alignment. Even if low in density compared to LA or San Francisco, there are still plenty of obstacles in the eastern Central Valley. While there is a state highway through the area, it didn't make as much sense to follow it. Its curve radiuses were designed for 65-mile-per-hour speeds, while the train needed gentler turns to keep its target 220-mile-per-hour speed, which was, once again, necessary to meet the legally mandated 2-hour and 40-minute timing. While the railroad could theoretically leave the highway's right-of-way during turns, the amount of building and infrastructure that had built up around the highway through time made this option more costly and complicated than the alternatives. Too much would have to get knocked down. Also available were existing freight railroads. Union Pacific and BNSF run through the area, and they had enough room alongside their existing tracks to fit more.
Yeah, I don't think you want to put a high-speed rail around freight rail, mainly because of ground vibrations. Now, according to Gemini, it puts that risk at number 3, but I disagree. Because ground vibrations caused by freight rail is death by 1,000 cuts. Routing the high-speed rail alongside the freight rail would probably blow the budget out of proportion because of the things you need to, put as a mitigation measure. So yeah, I don't think you want to route around the high-speed rail around the freight rail.
High-speed rail authorities started with Union Pacific, but they outright refused. They likely viewed high-speed rails as a potential obstacle to future development of their capacity-constrained, highly valuable track. It's very possible they'll want to build more capacity through the area in the future, and it'd be a lot more difficult if there were all sorts of high-speed rail viaducts and other structures getting in the way. So the High-Speed Rail Authority went to BNSF, which took a more cooperative approach. For proper compensation, they were willing to allow construction parallel to their right-of-way. But while this acted as a massive shortcut, there were still obstacles. For example, this, Colonel Allensworth State Historic Park. This preserves the only town in California that was founded and run by African Americans, and it sits on the National Register of Historic Places. Federal law prohibits projects with any federal funding, which the railroad would be, from taking land from sites in such status, so the high-speed railroad had to deviate around it. That meant, in this area, they did have to go through the time-consuming process of acquiring private land parcel by parcel. If individual owners in the railroad could come to an agreement, this was a relatively straightforward process, but if not, they'd enter a legal process that would span 3 to 7 years. In other sections, the complication was less so the obstacle, but more so the solution. The town of Hanford, for example, did not want the high-speed rail running through it, even though the freight railroad already did, and the rail authority wasn't interested in routing that way anyway, since the tight geometry of BNSF's right-of-way would force slower speeds. So rather, they'd build a bypass around the town, but this turned into a whole saga. Due to wetlands in the area, they'd have to go through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA to get a permit. The railroad initially preferred an alignment east of the city, but to properly evaluate, the federal regulators forced it to do a feasibility study on a western alignment. As the study went on, the planners actually started to favor the western alignment, and locals started advocating for it too, preferring its lower impact on the local area. The railroad was thinking that rather than building a viaduct, as they planned in the east, they could bury the tracks in a trench and route roads, freight rails, and other existing elements above it. But eventually, after yet further study, it became clear that the water table in the area was uniquely shallow, 10 to 15 feet rather than the usual 30 to 40. With all the pumping and water management infrastructure they'd need to make this work, it was looking more costly than their original eastern plan, so they went back to that. This whole flip-flop cost them about 2.5 years in planning, but also soured relations with the community, contributing to the initiation of a 13-year lawsuit between a local landowner, the County Board of Supervisors, and the railroad. At every step, small decisions led to long delays. But the last major routing decision along the railroad span turned into one of the most contentious of them all: how to get into San Francisco. Like LA, the Bay Area is surrounded by mountains on all sides, inevitably forcing another complicated, high-cost section. After initial exploratory study, two primary options were identified: Altamont Pass and Pacheco Pass. This northeastern route had a lot of advantages. It would pass through the growing population centers of Merced and Modesto, adding potential riders to the system. It would also follow the existing rail and interstate corridor, once again making things easier through using an existing right-of-way and existing power infrastructure. But it had a problem, and in the eyes of the High-Speed Rail Authority, a big one. Its northeastern entry to the Bay Area meant San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and San Jose could not be served by the same trains. Rather, they'd have to split the track into two directions and either split physical trains in two after the pass to go the separate directions, adding to trip times, or run separate services for San Francisco than San Jose, reducing service frequencies for both cities and therefore limiting the competitiveness of the network. This pushed the authority towards Pacheco Pass, and then other benefits stacked on top of that, like the avoidance of having to build an expensive new crossing of the bay itself and the routing through a less developed area. The decision, however, was massively controversial with NIMBYs and environmental groups, setting off a string of lawsuits which lasted for years. From top to bottom, from its earliest days through today, in large ways and small, the California High-Speed Rail project has consistently chosen ambition over practicality. It chose to run at some of the fastest speeds of any rail line worldwide. It chose to service essentially any population center along its route. It chose to build through downtowns rather than around them. It chose to build the absolute gold standard of high-speed rail services, but in doing so, might have flown too close to the sun. The plan presented to the voters in 2008 was just an absolute fantasy. It assumed costs on par with and a construction timeline faster than European high-speed systems, despite a complete lack of experience in such construction and a route through seismically active mountains and dense urban areas. It was also presented despite a mere fraction of funding actually secured, and now with costs estimated as much as 7 times higher, funding has dried up. That's why right now, construction is only in progress on the Central Valley segment, the easiest segment to build, serving the least amount of people. While this project is meaningful, significant progress has been made, it's still a small fraction of what's needed for a full San Francisco to LA run. Deep down, planners might have believed that the fantastical budgeting was a pragmatic necessity to get voter approval for an ultimately worthwhile system, but that decision now makes the project look like an absolute farce. While a closer look certainly finds cases of mismanagement during construction here and there, the larger problem is a massive mismatch between expectations and reality. Despite that, the perception from a lightly informed wider audience is that the way this project has progressed since approval is emblematic of corruption and incompetence in state governance, even though it was the planning phases where things really went wrong. That perception is making funding harder to come by. The federal government is now outright hostile to the project. If built fully, the California high-speed rail system will be one of the most impressive, most transformative rail projects ever constructed in the entire world. It will be the crown jewel of American rail infrastructure. But its future is now in serious jeopardy. This is always a debate in rail development: perfect versus good enough. Pragmatism is often what gets trains running in the 21st century. It's not the heyday of rail travel anymore. The economics are challenging, and compromise is what gets it done. Meanwhile, when perfect happens, it's perfect, but it often doesn't. As we've seen particularly in Asia and Europe, high-speed rail can have a transformative effect that improves the lives of people across a whole region.
Yeah, but the people in those regions also live in dense, tightly packed cities, which means that they have to deal with less urban sprawls like what you see in the US, right? Which also means that less legal battles when they have to acquire property from owners. Besides the fact that those governments of those countries tend to have stronger eminent domain laws in their books. Because of how their cities were built, they often don't really have to use it because they don't have to deal with the urban sprawl that the US have to deal with, right?
But transit accessibility can take different forms that have similar effects. Like, what if public transit was free? That's what Jason from Not Just Bikes explores in his new series Day Pass, where he travels to Luxembourg, the only country with completely free public transportation. He rides every form of public transit in the country as he explores what that's like and if it's worth it. I'd also recommend the other episodes in the first season where he goes to Nantes, the birthplace of public transit, and Copenhagen, one of the best cities in the world for biking. And this is just one of plenty of Nebula.
Okay, at least he has the decency to put the ad plug at the end of his videos. Alright. If California high-speed rail is ever going to be built, I think a major urban infrastructure redesign of Los Angeles and San Francisco need to happen before any benefits of the high-speed rail system can ever be realized. They need to move away from car dependency and into more public transportation side. Also, it's kind of difficult to overcome 70 years of impact due to the incentivization and suburban sprawl of American cities due to the presence of the interstate highways, leading to people owning quote unquote large properties that are out from the city, meaning that huge chunks of the high speed rail budget is actually to engage in legal battles against those owners for eminent domain purposes. Now, is this a case of too much government involvement or too little government involvement? Just find in the comment section below. Or is this a case of past government involvement leaving behind a trail of problems for the current government? Let's talk about it in the comment section below. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Leave a like, drop a comment, and hit that big subscribe button. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.